Why did Melkor get weak in the First Age? Hello all and welcome back to Storyteller's Codex. On this channel we do deep dives into the lore of Lord of the Rings, A Song of Ice and Fire and many more. Welcome. At the dawn of time, before the world was even formed, Melkor stood as the greatest of all Ainur. He was the most gifted, the most powerful, and the most ambitious of the divine beings created by Ilúvatar. While the other Ainur sang in harmony during the Ainulindale, the great music that shaped the universe, Melkor sought to weave his own themes into the song. This was the first discord, a rupture in the harmony of creation, a rebellion against the natural order. Melkor believed he could improve upon Ilúvatar's vision, that he could shape reality according to his own desires. His melodies clashed with the song of his brethren, creating dissonance. Yet, rather than halting his defiance, he revelled in it, asserting his independence and dominance. Even before the physical world was created, Melkor's hunger for control set him apart. This was not mere arrogance. It was the seed of his downfall. When the Ainur descended into Arda, the newly formed world, Melkor sought to establish his rule over it. But he was not alone. Manwë, his brother in spirit and the one chosen by Ilúvatar to lead the Valar, opposed him. This infuriated Melkor, for he saw himself as the rightful ruler. As the Valar shaped the world, Melkor waged war against their creation. Every mountain they raised, he tore down. Every sea they calmed, he stirred into chaos. His presence alone brought discord. Yet, rather than uniting with the others, he withdrew, isolating himself in bitterness and anger. Here, we see the first key moment of his weakening. His obsession with control led him to expend his own strength in ceaseless destruction. Unlike the other Valar, who worked in unity and preserved their power, Melkor poured his essence into defiling Arda. His dominion became his burden. Melkor's interference did more than simply disrupt the works of the Valar. It poisoned the fabric of Arda itself. His power was not simply exercised, it was spent, diffused, and embedded into the world. Unlike Sauron, who later concentrated his power into the One Ring, Melkor's influence was scattered. His malice seeped into the lands, the creatures, even the air itself. Darkness, fear, and decay became his signatures, and the world bore the scars of his corruption. But this came at a cost. With every act of destruction, with every defiled creation, Melkor lost a part of himself. His power, once limitless, became finite. He was not just spreading evil, he was unravelling his own essence. And so, the greatest of the Ainur, the one who sought to rule all, had unwittingly taken the first step toward his own downfall. As the Valar shaped Arda, Melkor saw their work as an obstacle to his dominion. He despised their designs and sought to undo them at every turn. He waged an unrelenting war upon their creations, bringing destruction to mountains, turning lakes into wastelands, and sowing discord across the land. Yet, despite his might, the Valar did not yield. They countered his destruction with creation, working together to heal what he had marred. The conflict became an endless cycle. Destruction followed by restoration. But while the Valar worked in harmony, Melkor fought alone, growing ever more frustrated as he failed to bend the world fully to his will. Realizing that he could not dominate openly, Melkor retreated into secrecy. He constructed Utumno, the first great stronghold of darkness, deep beneath the earth. Here, he gathered his dark power and spawned twisted creatures, beasts of shadow and flame, foul mockeries of the Valar's creations. From Utumno, his influence spread like a blight. The very land around it became tainted, a place where no light could reach, where fear and despair reigned. He bred monstrous servants, creating early forms of creatures that would later terrify the world. Perhaps even the first hints of orcs, long before they would become his foot soldiers. The Valar, sensing his growing strength, knew they could no longer ignore him. Thus began the First Great War of Arda. The Valar, led by Tulkas the Mighty Warrior, launched a full assault on Melkor's domain. A battle of titanic proportions erupted, with the forces of light clashing against the darkness of Utumno. For the first time, Melkor faced true opposition, and his overconfidence proved his undoing. Though powerful, he had already weakened himself by investing his essence into his domain. When Tulkas himself wrestled Melkor to the ground, the once mighty Dark Lord was bound in unbreakable chains, Anginor forged by the Valar for this very moment. Thus, Melkor was defeated and imprisoned in the halls of Mandos for 3 ages. It was his first great loss, a wound to both his pride and power, and yet, this was only the beginning of his descent into ruin. For 3 long ages, Melkor lay bound in the halls of Mandos, his fury simmering beneath the surface. The Valar, believing in redemption, sought to judge him fairly. Manwë, the High King of Arda, saw no inherent evil in Melkor that could not be undone, and granted him parole. But this was a grievous miscalculation. Melkor's captivity had not reformed him. It had only deepened his hatred and sharpened his cunning. Upon his release, Melkor feigned humility, acting as if he had seen the error of his ways. He walked among the Valar, whispering, observing, sowing seeds of doubt. Slowly he worked to divide them, manipulating their trust while secretly regaining his strength. It was during this period that he set his sights on the children of Ilúvatar, the elves, who had only recently awakened in Middle-earth. Rather than waging war outright, he chose a subtler path: infiltration, corruption, and the slow, deliberate poisoning of minds. His power, though weakened, was now wielded with greater precision. Melkor's greatest success came through the division of the elves. Among them were the Noldor, a proud and skilled race, led by Feanor, the greatest craftsman of the age. He saw in them an opportunity, ambition that could be turned against the Valar. Through half-truths and lies he whispered into their ears, stoking their discontent. He told them that the Valar sought to keep them as prisoners in Valinor, denying them dominion over Middle-earth. He spoke of hidden knowledge, of power beyond their understanding. Feanor, already resentful, became an unwitting pawn in his grand design. The discord that followed would lead to one of the most devastating events in Elven history: the exile of the Noldor. But Melkor's greatest sin was the creation of the Orcs. Captured elves, twisted and broken by his will, became the first Orcs, a mockery of Ilúvatar's creation, perverted and reshaped into instruments of malice. Their very existence was proof of Melkor's corruption made manifest. With each creature he twisted, a fraction of his divine essence drained away, further eroding his strength. This was the great paradox of Melkor. The more he sought to dominate and twist the world, the weaker he became. With his influence spreading like a shadow, Melkor saw his chance to strike a final blow against the Valar. Alongside Ungoliant, a monstrous entity of insatiable hunger, he carried out one of the most heinous acts in the history of Arda, the destruction of the 2 trees of Valinor. The light of the world was extinguished, plunging Valinor into darkness. In the ensuing chaos, Melkor did the unthinkable. He slew Finwë, the father of Feanor, and stole the Silmarils, the most precious jewels ever crafted. With these stolen treasures he fled to Middle-earth, where he fortified his stronghold of Angband and proclaimed himself Morgoth, the dark enemy of the world. But in this moment of triumph, Melkor had also sealed his fate. By claiming the Silmarils, he had drawn the unrelenting wrath of Feanor and the Noldor upon him. The greatest warriors of the elves swore undying vengeance against him, setting into motion the long and bloody wars that would define the First Age. And so, as he sat upon his iron throne in Angband, clutching the stolen Silmarils, he was already beginning to fade. His power, once limitless, was now bound to the very creations he had stolen and corrupted. He had escaped captivity, he had defiled the light, and he had waged war upon the free peoples of Middle-earth. But in doing so, he had spent himself irreversibly. The Dark Lord had returned, but he was no longer the god he once was. Melkor's influence over Arda was unlike that of the other Valar. Instead of merely shaping the world, he sought to dominate it, to possess it entirely. But true domination required more than force. It demanded the infusion of his own being into the very essence of Middle-earth. Unlike Sauron, who later concentrated his power into the One Ring, Melkor did not store his strength in a singular object. Instead, he poured his essence into everything he tainted. Every storm he unleashed, every mountain he corrupted, every beast he twisted, all carried a fragment of his once divine strength. The very land itself became an extension of his will, saturated with malice and decay. But each act of corruption came at a cost. He spent his own essence, weakening himself with every evil deed. What Melkor did not realise was that by binding himself to the physical world, he was dooming himself to be diminished alongside it. As Morgoth, the Dark Lord of Middle-earth, Melkor sat upon his throne in Angband, ruling through fear and destruction. But his very act of ruling drained him. Unlike the Valar, who maintained balance through cooperation, Melkor relied on brute force and terror. Every decision, every command required his direct intervention. He bred monstrous lieutenants, Balrogs, dragons, and twisted creatures of darkness, but he had to imbue them with part of his power to ensure their loyalty. He waged endless wars, each one taxing his finite strength. His paranoia grew, and he relied increasingly on his servants, Sauron chief among them, to maintain his dominion. While he once commanded godlike strength, Melkor was now a prisoner of his own need for control. As the First Age raged on, Morgoth continued to weaken. His power, once vast and immeasurable, had become tethered to the very things he sought to control. No longer could he walk the world as an unstoppable force. He was now confined to his fortress, issuing orders through intermediaries. By the time of the War of Wrath, Melkor was a shadow of the being who once defied the entire pantheon of the Valar. And when the Valar finally descended upon Middle-earth in force, he could not stand against them. He was dragged from his throne, chained once more in Angainor, and cast into the void. But the scars of his corruption would never fade. His presence lingered in the world, in the land itself, in the creatures he had twisted, in the darkness he had spread. His power was gone, but his shadow remained. Melkor was defeated, but his legacy, his malice, would haunt Middle-earth forever. As the First Age progressed, Melkor found himself increasingly reliant on others to enact his will. No longer the all-powerful deity that once shook the foundations of the world, he became a master who could not move without his servants. His greatest lieutenant was Sauron the Deceiver. Unlike his master, Sauron retained a keen strategic mind and an ability to mask his intentions behind cunning words. Melkor entrusted Sauron with governance over large portions of his domain, particularly the stronghold of Tol Garhoth, the Isle of Werewolves. It was through Sauron that Morgoth maintained his grip over the free peoples of Middle-earth. But this reliance had dire consequences. Each time Melkor delegated authority, he lost another measure of his once supreme power. He no longer led his armies into battle, no longer fought with his own hands. The Dark Lord of the First Age had become a ruler bound to his throne, his reach extending only as far as his underlings could carry his will. Sauron, for his part, thrived under Morgoth's rule, refining the arts of deception and domination, skills he would later use to forge his own empire in the Second Age. Already the seeds of Sauron's future defiance had been sown. Melkor's mastery over creatures was legendary. He bred the Balrogs, twisted the orcs, and brought forth dragons of fire and shadow, chief among them Glaurung, the father of dragons. But with every great beast he created, he poured part of his essence into them, fragmenting his divine power further. The Balrogs, once mighty spirits akin to Maya, became extensions of his will, but they also required his strength to sustain them. The orcs, bred from the tormented forms of elves, carried his malice, but their existence was a curse upon himself as much as upon the world. Glaurung and his dragon kin, terrible in their might, owed their existence to Melkor's dwindling force, and he grew weaker for everyone he unleashed upon the world. Unlike Sauron, who later bound his strength into a single artifact, the One Ring, Melkor wasted himself upon his creations. Each new monster, each twisted soul, was a tether that drained his power. Where once he could have stood against the Valar alone, he now required his creatures to fight for him. The godlike strength that had once defied the entire pantheon was now dispersed among his minions, leaving him increasingly hollow and dependent. With the Valar still removed from direct intervention in Middle-earth, Melkor should have been at his most powerful. Yet he feared the day when they would return. His paranoia grew, and with it his reliance on dark fortifications and endless armies. No longer a bold conqueror, he became a brooding tyrant, withdrawn in the depths of Angband. Where once he roamed freely, he now remained hidden within his fortress, commanding from a distance. Where once he struck terror through his own might, he now sent forth others in his stead. Where once his name alone was enough to cow his enemies, his fear of an inevitable reckoning kept him caged within the shadows. This fear was not unfounded. The elves, led by the mighty warriors of the Noldor, waged ceaseless wars against him. His armies, though vast, were not infinite. His creations, though terrible, could be slain. By the time of the War of Wrath, Melkor was no longer the Titan who had faced the Valar in open defiance. He had become a being diminished by his own actions. He was no longer a god among gods, but a tyrant shackled by his own web of control. And when the Valar finally did return, he found himself incapable of standing against them. The Melkor of old would have fought with fury. The Morgoth of the First Age cowered in his halls, knowing that his time had come. For centuries, Melkor had reigned over Middle-earth, consolidating his power within the fortress of Angband. Yet despite his stronghold and vast armies, his influence was waning. The First Age had been marked by countless battles, but now the tide was turning against him. The Noldor, the Edain, and the remnants of the Free Peoples had suffered greatly, but they had not been broken. Their resilience forced Melkor into a defensive posture, relying more on his minions while he secluded himself in the depths of his fortress. As Middle-earth teetered on the brink, the Valar could no longer ignore Morgoth's corruption. The cries of the elves and men reached the ears of Manwë, and the Valar at last resolved to act. They would launch an assault unlike any before, a battle that would shake the world to its core, the War of Wrath. The host of the Valar, led by Eowyn, the herald of Manwë, descended upon Middle-earth, an army of unthinkable might, consisting of Maiar elven warriors and the great forces of the West, sailed upon the shores of Beleriand. The war to end Melkor's dominion had begun. The War of Wrath was a cataclysm. The skies burned, the lands trembled, and the seas rose in fury. The host of the Valar shattered Morgoth's armies, scattering the orcs, balrogs, and dragons he had bred for war. What had once been his greatest strengths, his hordes of twisted creatures, were now faltering in the face of divine retribution. Melkor's forces, so long reliant on overwhelming numbers and terror, found themselves hopelessly outmatched. His balrogs, the terrifying demons of shadow and flame, were nearly exterminated. Only a few managed to escape, fleeing deep into the mountains where they would slumber for ages to come. The mighty dragons, including Ankalagan the Black, ravaged the forces of the Valar for a time, but even they were eventually defeated, with Eärendil delivering the final blow. As the walls of Angband crumbled under the relentless siege, Melkor withdrew deeper into the pits of his fortress. He, who had once strode across Arda as a god of destruction, now cowered beneath the weight of his impending doom. His fear, long buried beneath arrogance, had consumed him. With his forces annihilated, Melkor's end was inevitable. Eowyn and the armies of the Valar descended upon him, tearing down the last defences of Angband. When the Dark Lord was finally dragged from his hiding place, he no longer resembled the mighty entity that had once defied the Valar in the days of his prime. His power was spent, his creations had drained him, his ambitions had hollowed him, and his relentless war had exhausted him beyond recovery. He was no longer a godlike being, but a defeated tyrant, trembling before his captors. As punishment for his crimes, Melkor was bound in chains once more with Angainor, the same chain that had held him before. But this time, there would be no imprisonment in Mandos. He was cast beyond the world itself, thrust into the void, where he would remain until the end of time. Even in exile, however, his malice lingered. The echoes of his corruption remained in the world, woven into its very fabric. His essence, though banished, had permanently scarred Middle-earth, and his most faithful servant Sauron would rise in his wake, ensuring that the darkness he had sown would never be truly eradicated. And thus the First Age came to an end, with the defeat of the first and mightiest Dark Lord. But the shadow of Morgoth would never be entirely vanquished. Though Melkor was cast into the void, his presence never truly left Arda. Unlike the other Valar who shaped the world in harmony with Ilúvatar's vision, Melkor had poured his essence into its very fabric, leaving a taint that could never be fully undone. This corruption endured, influencing the hearts of creatures in the very land itself. The wounds of Beleriand, once a land of splendour, would never heal. Much of it was swallowed by the sea, and the lands that remained bore the scars of war and darkness. The creatures he had twisted, orcs, trolls, and remnants of his monstrous experiments, would linger long after his fall, spreading chaos in his absence. Evil was now a force woven into the world, not merely a single entity to be vanquished. Though Morgoth was gone, the potential for darkness remained, waiting for new hands to wield it. This meant that, despite his defeat, his work was not undone. The influence of Melkor was now embedded in Middle-earth, and it would take ages before the world could find peace, if it ever would. Of all the servants Morgoth had gathered, none were more cunning or ambitious than Sauron. Unlike his master, Sauron had not poured his strength into the world carelessly. He had learned from Melkor's mistakes. While Morgoth had spread his power thinly over Arda, Sauron understood the value of concentrating power in objects, later forging the One Ring as the ultimate instrument of control. Sauron did not rule through brute force alone, but through deception, coercion, and manipulation. Where Morgoth ruled with fire and fear, Sauron ruled with guile and subtlety. After the fall of his master, Sauron feigned repentance before the Valar, much as Melkor had once done, but his ambitions never died. Though the First Age had ended, Sauron took the lessons of Morgoth and built upon them, ensuring that Melkor's shadow endured. The Second Age would belong to Sauron, but it was Melkor's teachings that paved the way for his rise. Though cast into the void, it is foretold that Morgoth's exile is not eternal. According to certain prophecies, he will one day return in an apocalyptic final battle, Dagor Dagorath, the last battle. It is said that Melkor will break free from the void, leading a final war against the Valar and the free peoples of Middle-earth. In this final battle, the last remnants of his influence will be eradicated, and Arda itself will be remade, freed from the corruption he had instilled. But whether this prophecy is true remains uncertain. Some believe it is merely a legend, while others claim it is Ilúvatar's will that Melkor's evil will one day be utterly destroyed. Regardless of the prophecy's truth, one thing is certain. The world of Middle-earth would never be the same after Morgoth's fall. His shadow, his teachings, and his corruption had left a permanent mark on the world, and though he was gone, his legacy would shape the fate of Middle-earth for ages to come. Thus, the tale of Melkor, the mightiest of the Ainur, ends not in absolute destruction, but in a lingering, eternal influence. His body was banished, his power diminished, but his will remained, a dark whisper in the hearts of those who would seek to follow in his footsteps. Even in exile, his malice endured, shaping the world in unseen ways. His legacy would pass to Sauron, to the shadowed corners of Middle-earth, and to the hearts of those who sought dominion at any cost. Evil had become more than just one being. It had become part of the world's very fabric, an eternal battle woven into the fate of Arda. Yet hope endured. For as long as darkness exists, so too will those who stand against it. The Valar, the Elves, and the free peoples of Middle-earth would continue their struggle, knowing that even in the deepest shadow, light could still be kindled. The First Age had ended, but the war for the soul of Middle-earth would continue, and so the great cycle of darkness and defiance would play on, shaping the ages to come.